Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madeline Smith, and I am the Director of Higher Education here at the Institute. Thanks so much for joining us for today's Post-Secondary Pathways webinar titled Attainment for All, Using Disaggregated Data to Close Equity Gaps. Today's webinar is a bit of a prelude to the third issue brief in our ongoing Attainment for All series, which will be released in the coming weeks. We are excited for the interactive format of today's webinar, and with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and today's moderator, Dr. Wynn Decker.
Thanks, Dr. Smith. We're excited that you're all here today. I see some participants still logging in, so we'll give people about 30 more seconds, but we've got a great panel today, and I'm excited to really dive into disaggregated data. So let's give audience members about 30 more seconds to a minute to log in, and then I'll get us going. All right, great. Well, thanks again for being here. As Dr. Smith said, my name is Dr. Wynn Decker. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst on the Higher Ed team. We're excited that you're here for this Post-Secondary Pathways webinar with the Hunt Institute. We've got a great panel of 7 people that will be talking about disaggregated data. And as we're doing this, you can always remember you can find us on Facebook Live. We're also on YouTube Live, and the recordings will be there as well. And if you want to hang along with us on Twitter, you can use Post Pathways as the hashtag and follow us at the Hunt Institute or Hunt Higher Ed. But again, we appreciate you being here today. We have a great set of resource experts that speak both on national and North Carolina specific issues related to disaggregated data. As Dr. Smith mentioned, we'll have an interactive activity for everyone. So we're really excited to get audience participation in that. But before we really dive in, I just wanted to quickly frame the discussion for us. Oftentimes we talk about data in higher ed and know that it's critically important for us to understand how our policies and practices are working. Aggregated data is where we take sources collected from data from multiple sources, and we collect them and we add them into one large compiled set where we can make summaries that provide broader trends and understandings of student populations, helps us make data-informed decisions. But we know when we aggregate data, it sometimes has the ability of shielding trends that might not be seen in larger groups. And so when we talk about disaggregated data, we're talking about breaking that down into smaller units for analysis, whether that's breaking it down by race, gender, age, employment status, or any other small subgroup. The idea of this is breaking data down so that we can see trends that might be hidden in larger aggregate data sets. Like Madeline said, there's a brief coming out later this month about disaggregated data that we'll explore in more detail. But before we got to that point, we wanted to bring the resource experts in that have the knowledge and content expertise around disaggregated data. And so I'm excited for this conversation. We'll start with opening remarks and then move into interactive, followed by a Q&A. But with that, I want to go to our first panelist, Dr. Jessica Howell. Dr. Howell is the Vice President of Research for College Board. Dr. Howell, thank you for being here today. Can you tell us more about how College Board uses disaggregated data and why it's critical to you all's work in education equity?
Thanks so much, Wynn, Madeline, and everyone, of course, at the Hunt Institute for hosting this important topic. I'd be happy to kick off the conversation about the value of data and disaggregated data in particular. The research team at the College Board relies on disaggregated data to study students' trajectories from high school to post-secondary, and in some cases even into the labor market. We typically rely on longitudinal data views to help us identify equity gaps as they sometimes grow and contract over a student's lifetime, and thereby identify opportunities to drive equity and equality and outcomes. And it's really the data that provide the foundation on which we can build this evidence, and then it's the evidence that helps inform College Board members, school districts, colleges, scholarship organizations about all the actions that they can take to propel students into success. I'd love to kick us off with a brief tangible example from one part of my research portfolio, and it's a really timely one for anyone with high school students in their lives. You probably know that tomorrow wraps up the final day of AP exams for this school year, except for the late testing window that occurs in the latter half of the month. Advanced placement is actually a really big part of my team's research portfolio, and we rely heavily on data to understand simple things like who's taking AP and how they're doing on exams, but also how they're utilizing credits they earn in college for AP, what kinds of college and early outcomes they're having because of their AP experiences. And we can examine all of these questions for different types of students attending different types of colleges, and even from different high schools. So for example, we've been using data on AP students to understand how students who receive college credit for their AP experiences are performing in sort of subsequent intermediate level college courses. And we find that AP students who receive credit for those intro courses while in high school perform as well or better in their intermediate level college courses compared to similar students who took those courses on campus. We can also use data on AP students to understand how the number of APs is taken and linked to college outcomes like college GPA and bachelor's degree completion, right? And so here there's really good news for students and all the parents and school counselors that advise them that students actually don't need to take 15 to 20 APs to reap the benefits of these rigorous high school courses. Our research using this data shows that the biggest boost in college GPA and degree completion actually comes from that first AP, and that the benefits, sort of increase, but then level off at around 5 APs. And so that's a really good, healthy message for students to hear, maybe especially since the pandemic, that a handful of AP courses is going to have a nice impact on their college outcomes. And it's just one example of how disaggregated data allows us to confirm that these benefits, in this case, AP benefits, accrue equitably to all types of students attending all types of colleges.
Thank you for that, Dr. Howell. And I think it just speaks to the greater idea of higher ed data that, also having that high school data, having that AP data is critical to creating that full picture of how a student is going to succeed in college. So thanks for that. Well, great. Next, I want to go to our team from the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. A lot of people on here have probably heard of it before. But Dr. Tara Lowry is the post-secondary branch chief for NCES, and Sam Barbett is the math statistician. We'll go to Dr. Lawley for this first question, but thanks for being here. Can you give us just a general overview of NCES and how your work supports post-secondary success?
Sure. Thanks, Wayne, for the intro, and thanks everyone for being here today. As Wayne mentioned, my name is Tara Lawley, so I'm the post-secondary branch chief and the director of the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPEDS, at the National Center for Education Statistics. So some of you probably know me from letters that you receive telling you about what you need to do for IPEDS reporting. My name's often signed at the end of there. So if you're familiar with me for that, nice to talk with you. So NCES is the primary federal entity that collects and analyzes data related to education in the US and in other nations. It's part of the Department of Education and part of the Institute of Education Sciences that sits within the department. So NCES has a congressional mandate, I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice, to collect, collate, analyze, and report complete statistics on the condition of American education. And to also review and report on education activities internationally. So other than IPEDS, you may be familiar with the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, or the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, or TIMSS. So those are just a few examples of the studies that NCES does. IPEDS specifically is a system of surveys that's conducted every year by the NCES, and we gather information from every college, every university, and every technical and vocational institution if they participate in federal student financial aid programs. So if they're eligible to receive Title IV federal funding. Excuse me. Through this collection, IPEDS provides the basic data that are needed to describe and analyze trends in post-secondary education in the US and the outlying areas. We collect data on enrollment, student success and completion, cost and pricing, and institutional resources, including financing and staffing. Sorry. We work a lot with Congress, other federal agencies, state governments, education providers, a lot of professional associations, and even students and parents and others who really rely on IPEDS data to get some basic information on post-secondary institutions. On top of that, all of our data are publicly available and can be accessed through the College Navigator or through our other IPEDS data tools. So we provide all of these data to the public to use for research purposes. So that's that's a brief intro to what NCES does related to post-secondary. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice, so I'm just gonna turn it over.
That's all right. We really appreciate it, Dr. Holly. Thanks for being here, and Sam, thanks for being here as well. All of us probably use NCES data quite frequently, so we appreciate all the work that you do in that space. Great. We'll want to move us right along to our next panelist, Dr. McCall Carlander, Professor of Education Policy and Chair of the School of Education at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Carlander, thank you for being here. Can you talk to us about the importance of disaggregated data in research and how some of the data mentioned today so far influences your work?
Sure. Thank you. And I'll add my thanks to the organizers and for inviting me here today. So a lot's been said about the importance of disaggregated data. And thanks to the NCS team, I've used much of the national data in my research. More recently, I've been working a lot with California data, which is a little behind the from North Carolina in terms of building longitudinal data systems, which I know we're going to talk about later. But through partnerships I've had with the state agencies in California, I've done a lot of work to disaggregate data by really key things that we know matter in students' educational trajectories. So one that is obvious that is on top of mind for our topic today on equity is race. In recent years, given the diverse population of California, we've done a lot to disaggregate, for example, Asian subgroups. The Asian population in California is incredibly diverse. And all the state systems are now doing a better job collecting subgroup information. In particular, we've been disaggregating Filipino populations, Southeast Asian subgroups as well. We know that those equity gaps look really different depending on how you disaggregate those equity groups. So that's one example. We also spent a lot of time thinking about English learners in California and even further disaggregation of English learners. Were they always English learners in the education system? Were they reclassified? So we have really detailed level data to understand the experiences of English learners in our through their education life course in California, both from pre-K all the way to potentially still being classified as English learners as they enter college. The last one I'll mention, well, first I'll just note that there's really important research to understand race-gender interactions as we think about equity gaps. So we know girls are outperforming boys in terms of educational attainment, and that happens quite early and continues. But those differences, the gender differences by race are also something we've been trying to track because while they exist interestingly, for all racial ethnic groups, they do vary. The last example I'll just give is on age. So many of us have been tracking the huge enrollment declines that we're experiencing, particularly at community colleges. Our state has the largest community college system in the country, and we've been trying to understand those enrollment declines. And what we're learning is that older students, potentially new older students that would have been starting college but for the pandemic, has really declined. So we're just aggregating in particular age and race to learn that actually men of color are really missing right now from community colleges. And so those are some of the key ways in which disaggregated data has really driven our efforts to understand equity gaps in educational attainment.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Carlander. It's really fascinating. We appreciate the research that you do. We've also been diving into the Asian American student population and really understanding how disaggregating that data shows some of the equity gaps that still exist. So excited to see the work coming out of California and the work you're doing. Well, great. We'll go. So we've talked to Dr. Howell from a nonprofit. We talked to NCES, got to talk to an academic. Now let's go to Lisa Moore, who's at SAS. Lisa is the Senior Analytical Consultant at SAS. Lisa, we really appreciate you being on. Can you tell us more about your role in the way disaggregated data supports initiatives in the work you do at a place like SAS?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to start by thanking you for including me in this discussion. I was very excited to join. Senior analytical consultant is a fancy word for saying I'm a data scientist. And I work with a lot of institutions across the country using data and analytics to help address some of their most challenging problems. And this often involves using a combination of descriptive analytics to help them better understand where they are and where they have been, predictive analytics to determine potential outcomes, and then prescriptive analytics to determine ways to potentially change those outcomes. So I joke sometimes that my title really should be a mythbuster, because I often start by using disaggregated data and analytics to dispel a lot of different myths and then put a spotlight on what's actually going on. And by doing this, we help to democratize information and then initiate those sometimes tough conversations that have to happen in order for change to come. Side note, I do have a student that is actually taking AP exams today. So Dr. Howell, I appreciate your efforts.
Thanks for that, Lisa. And it's just such a critical to the work is really diving into that data. And the next step, you know, we've talked about some predictive analytics and the ability to truly support students. We know that everyone experiences higher ed differently. And so how can we use data to support students? So thanks for the work you do at SAS. Well, great. Last but certainly not least, we want to bring it home to North Carolina. We know a lot of our panelists use North Carolina data. And so we've got a great team from the North Carolina Department of Commerce with us. Mayway Bodane is the Assistant Secretary for Policy Research and Strategy at the North Carolina Department of Commerce, Labor and Economic Analysis Division. And Dr. Alexander Moshkin is the Director of Data Analytics and Research for the North Carolina Department of Commerce. Mayway, thanks for being here. Can you tell us, first off, tell us what LEAD stands for, the work you do at LEAD, and how the data informs your work in North Carolina?
Thank you. I want to thank the Hung Institute for having us at North Carolina in the panel discussion. And the North Carolina Department of Commerce, Labor and Economic Analysis Division, that's mouthful, but we always call it LEAD, L-E-A-D. So it is the division is the state's primary source for workforce, economic, and labor market information. We do data collection, analysis, produce the key economic indicators, information, analytical dashboard to support the state's workforce and economic development activities, as well as education planning. Aside from the labor market information we produce, the division oversees the operation of the common follow-up system. And it is the North Carolina's longitudinal data system, which provides the education and employment outcomes of the public education, employment, and training programs. The information is used to support policymaking, program evaluation, resource allocation, and also career planning. All of these works help better align the workforce need in the state. So that way, you know, when the community college system or UNC system, they have a question regarding do they need to establish a particular program, we are able to use the information we produce in the shop to provide and projections, one of them. And they always say ROI, the return on investment. So we are tagging to our common follow system to address some of the questions in relate to program planning. So that's a short introduction of the LEAD division. But I'm sure we have more to discuss later on. So save that for later.
Absolutely, and thank you for that opening. And Alex, we look forward to bringing you the conversation just a little bit, but I just wanted to touch on the economic and policy analysis part. I think so often in higher ed, we talk about aligning our programs and our educational needs with the workforce needs and the labor trends. And the work you do at LEAD is so critical to being able to have that data. So thank you for that. Well, great. Now that we've got some introductions done, this is the interactive portion. So audience members, if you're with us, go ahead and warm up your typing fingers. What we're going to do at this point is I've got some questions that are just going to be some simple agree or disagree questions. I will ask the panelists if they agree or disagree with the question. Audience members, if you want to participate, we're asking you to drop agree or disagree in the chat based on what you think. But after we get answers from folks, then I'll turn to one or two panelists and get a little more detail on the question. But panelists, give me a thumbs up if everyone's ready to go, and we'll get to looking at it. Well, great. All right, so question number one I have for the group. Do you agree or disagree? Disaggregated data are easy to analyze. Agree or disagree? Disaggregated data are easy to analyze. Seeing lots of disagrees on the board. I see lots of disagrees coming in from our audience members as well. Yeah, so we're seeing lots of disagreeing that it's easy to analyze. And I think that's probably one of the failures of using disaggregated data is oftentimes we know it's available, but not necessarily how to use it. It all depends. Yeah, Bridget, I totally agree with you. It really does all depend. But yeah, let's go to Dr. Lawley. I'd love to hear from you just a little bit about why you think it's not as easy to analyze disaggregated data as maybe we'd like for it to be.
Sure. Sorry, let me turn that on there. So I did real quickly. There was a comment about iPad's race ethnicity categories in the chat. So before we get started, I'll just quickly say we are limited by the OMB and the Department of Education's requirements for what we collect, which are aggregations of what can be disaggregated at the campus level. So I did want to just put that out there. It's not that we're not aware of some of those challenges, but I think it gets to some of what I would say about using disaggregated data or just disaggregated data in general. So one challenge for us with getting more detailed disaggregated data is really gets into the privacy issues. So as soon as you started getting into more and more disaggregation, you have to think about how to present that information. So let's just go with the aggregated categories that we do collect that are mandated by the Office of Management and Budget. Even in those cases, when you start to break some of those things down by race, ethnicity, by gender, by student full-time or part-time status, all these things, you run into a challenge of presenting that data. So how do you present that data without risking student privacy? This has been a big thing with us because a lot of people also want us to collect more information on gender identity. Currently, we only collect on male and female categories. We don't have another category. We are adding another gender, but only at the total level, because how easy would it be to identify another gender, Native American, Pacific Islander at an institution? There's, when you have small groups of students, that becomes a challenge. Another example that I would say why I think it's challenging is we have very disaggregated program classifications, the classification of instructional programs or CIP codes. And whenever I go to train people on how to use data, we avoid that file as much as possible unless Sam is there. And because really, if you want to get at the detail level of the race, ethnicity by gender by CIP code, you need something a lot more powerful than a lot of people are familiar with. You can't drop it into Excel easily and get everything that you need to. So it's a challenge there. When you start getting these files, they become very large and most people just are not equipped to handle them. So it's great if you have someone on your team or your staff who's able to deal with that, but if you don't, that can present a real challenge. And then finally, I would just say when you start trending on really small numbers, so yeah, it's great to be able to say, hey, we see this really small subgroup going up and down, but when it's a very small number, what does that trend really mean? And you really need a more sophisticated statistical analyses to be able to describe that, which then makes it harder to explain to the average person on the street. So, we see this all the time when we talk about data visualizations, about how do we make a data visualization that really shows what's happening. And when you get smaller and smaller disaggregations, sometimes those data visualizations are a lot more challenging or a lot less meaningful.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Lawley. And for the risk of putting you on the spot, Dr. Howell, I actually want just maybe 30 seconds or so. I saw a lot of people nodding about this idea of masking some data and the importance of data privacy. Can you just maybe just 30 seconds or so about why privacy is important when we're talking about the disaggregated data?
Oh, absolutely. I will, of course, echo what Dr. Lawley said about small numbers making groups of students recognizable. There are only so many students in certain groups in certain states with certain behaviors, and we just have to take very seriously that in many cases we're talking about minors, and it's just good data practice to do data work without revealing anybody's private business.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And again, I'm going to shamelessly plug our brief that's coming out. We talk about privacy and transparency in data and some state level best practices in that. So looking forward to talking about that more later on. Great. Well, let's move on to our second agree or disagree question. We'll first ask the audience in the panel, but agree or disagree that it is the state's responsibility to collect disaggregated data? Do folks agree or disagree that it is the state's responsibility to collect disaggregated data? So I'm seeing some agrees in the audience. I'm seeing a few disagrees. Great. Agree and disagree from Dr. Lawley and Lisa. Yeah, so we're kind of all over the board. Agree among others. Yeah, this is great. So, and I think Mimi called it right, and I think we'll get into this more. It's not exclusively the state's role, but it is part of their role. So let's go to you, Mei Wei. You said you agree with this. What do you see as the state's responsibility to collecting disaggregated data?
So I have to agree because the work we are doing here is a legislative mandate. So we are carrying out the work because the General Assembly requires us to produce the analysis and the operation report every year, even every other 2 years for program evaluation report. So the common follow-up system was created and assigned to us by our General Assembly to collect information for program participants. So that includes the demographic information such as gender, race, location, and this information is used to support and improve the workforce and education program in the state. So main reason I say agree, really is a legislative mandate for us to carry out this work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, one of the things that was mentioned in there, and I think we'll dive into more, is even if a state collects it across different organizations, do they always match? You know, can you always align that data so that you can truly do some of that longitudinal analysis? So appreciate that. Lisa, to put you on spot maybe for 30 seconds, I saw you do the agree, disagree. Did it have to do with maybe the other people that are also responsible for collecting data? Was that your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the responsibility lies within the institutions themselves. But then I do recognize that the state also needs that information. But I think there's additional responsibility and ethics behind making certain that that information is going to remain private and not reveal too terribly much.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that. Well, let's stay on state data in this idea of being able to combine and analyze it. I might have got a little ahead of myself, but the next question would be, agree or disagree, state data sources are easy to compile and analyze. So audience members, do you find it easy to compile and analyze state data? Agree or disagree? Absolutely not, I saw from Chanel. Yeah, we're getting some strong disagreeing with this. Dr. Kurlander's got a little agree, so we might have to come to her as well. But first I want to go to you, Alex, because you work with state data. And I believe you said, did you say disagree there? Is that what I saw from
Disagree,
you?
absolutely.
Yeah, so why do you disagree with that, son?
I would say even within a single state, all data comes from very, very different agencies and institutions and that collect this data and process this data. And working with those different sources is often a challenge because they all have different operational, functional reporting standards. So using that data requires knowledge of each of them and be able to make a meaningful analysis. And just to give a few examples how it might be a challenge, every agency uses a different time period: state fiscal year, federal fiscal year, calendar year, quarter, semester. They tend to use different IDs for participants. Very often it's either social security number or a federal employer ID number, but almost every other agency tries to invent their own ID for their participants. Often agencies do not have access to their data. They cannot change, they are logged in with a specific vendor, and they cannot produce any customized data for a specific analysis. Very often data sources or data itself is a compilation of different data sets coming from different institutions. Like the Central Office for Community Colleges collects data from dozens of individual colleges. and not necessarily that data matches. So kind of following your earlier comment, it's very difficult to align data which comes from different places. And finally, it's administrative data, which is always messy and not very consistent, because even for legislative reasons, there is some change in legislature, changes in reporting standards. So you get data which is not consistent year by year simply because something has changed, and you have to be an insider to actually know what has happened. And it's not just a data twist or something like bad data. So it sounds like I'm complaining. Anyways, so I would totally disagree with this being an easy task, but it's interesting work.
We appreciate it, and you're not complaining. You're highlighting some of the inefficiencies that we have in our data systems that keeps us from really doing some of the analysis. So no, I appreciate that, and I think you made a great point about the collection time periods and when fiscal year versus other things in. It does make a difference in being able to align it. Quickly, Dr. Carlander, do you mind if I come to you? You had an agree and disagree up, so maybe 30 seconds on what the agree
Sure.
are.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree with everything Alexander said, because that was so well said, down to the business rules around data definitions and how they all differ. I'm an eternal optimist. I've been watching California try to do this, and think that we also hid behind the difficulty for many years, deciding that it wasn't going to work. And as a person who's done it by brute force in my own little research shop, it is possible you might get only 90% of the match or whatever. But so my optimism was really my agree, because I feel like it's time. There's lots of great data science out there and ways to do this. And so I think that's hence my kind of don't want us to hide behind the challenges, though couldn't agree more with all of the challenges that Alexander, plus more. I'm sure he and I could have rattled off many others of the challenges. So that's all. I won't put both anymore, so you don't pick on me, Win. So
that's if you give me a chance to call on you, I might do it. So that's no, I really appreciate it. And talking about those state level data, we are moving in a better direction. NCES had some great state longitudinal data system grants to really help states try to grow out that system. So we might not be there yet, but I do think we're moving towards that place where we can really align data. So excited for that. I think we've got about 3 more agree or disagree questions, and then we'll go to audience. I've seen a couple of questions come up from the audience members as well. So, but our 4th question is really going to talk about NCES. And so agree or disagree, NCES provides disaggregated data that are critical to assessing post-secondary access and success. NCES data is critical to assessing post-secondary access and success. Ooh, a lot of double C's, double S's there. I apologize. Lots of agrees. Awesome. Yeah, and agrees are in the audience as well. The data is critical. Yeah, man. This is great. So Sam, want to unmute yourself, but we'd love to come to you and kind of ask you about some of the disaggregated data that NCES collects and why it's critical to assessing post-secondary success.
Sure. Well, we have about 5 student-based surveys. We have our fall enrollment and our 12-month enrollment surveys, and that aggregates data by race and gender to measure access. We have our completions data that Tara mentioned. It is quite a big file, but again, that's by race, ethnicity, and award levels, and you could do stuff. Who's getting degrees and STEM degrees, and who's getting health degrees or business, and supply and demand over time. And our graduation rate survey obviously is key in doing disaggregations by gender and race, and who is graduating. We also began adding Pell information, but unfortunately that is not by race and gender, but you are going to be able to measure who's completing and student success by Pell and non-Pell, or even by Stafford loan and non-Stafford loan. And we make this data available in our data center, and we have a nice little function that's very popular, a trend generator, that allows you to build tables over time and to trend these tables any which way you want. So I think it is critical. What we do have, I know it's not enough. I mean, I get questions on, do you have it by low income, first generation students, who's, etc. So, but for what we do have, I think we do meet the goals here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, Sam. And I totally agree. We are frequently in the name's gonna escape me, but in the iPad system, pulling that data down, really looking at it. And I think what you said is right about we're not able to collect every single piece of information. And, you know, as a researcher, one of the things I had to process through was what are appropriate proxies for things. And so, you know, does Pell Grant recipient, is that a good proxy for low income? And, you know, there's arguments both ways. And, you know, just working through what the data truly means. Dr. Kurlander mentioned data definitions earlier. I think it's really important that we're outlining what the data is, or what the data are that we're collecting, and who it really represents. And so thanks for all your work, Sam. Great. 2 more questions for us. Let's dive a little more into closing racial and ethnic equity gaps, but agree or disagree? Longitudinal data systems are critical for closing racial/ethnic equity gaps. Agree or disagree? Getting some agrees in the audience. Lots of agrees. Yeah. Well, Dr. Kurlander, you kind of mentioned this earlier, so I'd like to hear you kind of expand on this a little bit. But why are these longitudinal data systems? Why do you agree that they're critical for closing racial and ethnic equity gaps?
Let's see, there's so many reasons. So the first is just that we know that inequalities can perpetuate. And so most policies, federal, state, otherwise local, trying to disrupt some of those inequalities. So we as I think Dr. Howell already mentioned, we want to first identify, use data to figure out where they are, where's a good point of intervening. But then we also want to be able to know if it works and when, and does it fade out? Or do those policies continue to sustain? So I think for all those reasons, we want to be able to look at longitudinal data. We know early childhood matters for deep into even adulthood, and so that's one example. But we also know policies, just even at a smaller scale, policies, for example, that we might not think about, like sort of course placements in middle school, may impact the trajectory of students in high school. In California, for example, you needed to take a set of courses to meet 4-year eligibility, but some students start high school already so far behind, for example, in math course taking, that really, unless someone's looking at that data and trying to track it, might rule students out from eligibility. And I'll give one more example. Things that are hot right now these days are dual enrollment policies and expansion. North Carolina has a lot of active early college high school programs, and California has been unable until recently to really track students' dual enrollment and their impact on post-secondary education because of our segmented data systems. Integrating them to look at longitudinal data outcomes allows us to look at how students fare in college relative to, or not relative, but sort of to track their earlier K-12 experiences and their impacts on post-secondary education, including things like AP, dual enrollment, career technical education exposure, and many other things. And so I think we've known for a long time the gaps exist, but being able to understand where they originate and to be able to intervene in policies is really critical.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Thank you for that. So the Hunt Institute we released Attainment for All series. In the first brief of that 3-part series, we really looked at where equity gaps emerge across the education continuum, and that we know getting to higher ed and just expecting to close them there is not sufficient to the work. And this longitudinal data is so important to that. So thank you for that work. And you know, we're big proponents of the data quality campaign, really pushing for a longitudinal data system that starts, you know, pre-K all the way through workforce placement. And so just, you know, having some portions of the data is not enough. And so building these longitudinal systems is so critical. Last and final question, because I know that a lot of the audience members might work at institution higher ed, but we've also got folks that work at nonprofits, that work at private organizations, that have philanthropic wings, that do higher ed work. So just generally, I wanted to ask, agree or disagree, organizations should utilize disaggregated data in their work? Agree or disagree? Getting several agrees, Seeing some agrees in the audience. Someone said, great question. I appreciate it. That's you. We worked hard to draft these. So that's, just thinking through the things that we work at the Hunt Institute. This is something that comes up a lot. So I think I'll come to you, Dr. Howell, first, but you said you agree that organizations should use disaggregated data. Why do you agree with that, and maybe some ways you use it?
Sure. So in many cases, I think it's organizations that might have the easiest time collecting very fine-grained data from individuals or from the institutions that they serve, simply by attaching data collection processes onto other operational processes as they interact with, say, students or colleges. Again, lots of different constituencies. We do a lot of this at the College Board. We interact, our membership includes many school districts across the country. And so we, of course, have relationships with AP teachers and school counselors and, college counselors that help students transition into higher ed, as well as colleges and scholarship organizations. If every interaction with any of these individuals, including also the many students that we serve, incorporates some sort of data collection activity, then we're much more well positioned to know the answers to many, many important educational questions, and just have the data at our disposal, through our assessments, programs, initiatives, reach. College Board actually serves about 85% of every high school graduating class in the US through PSAT and SAT and AP, right? And so it's of course our responsibility to demonstrate how these assessments and programs and initiatives are working for students and schools and teachers, colleges, but all different subgroups of students attending all different types of high schools who wind up at all different types of colleges. And so we utilize the data to make sure we know the answers to those questions. I also would just say that organizations might also be very well situated to have opportunities to combine their data with other data resources in a way that broadens the impact of the research and analysis, even the disaggregated data that you can put out. We do this in many ways, but one really great example is that we partner with the National Student Clearinghouse, and that gives us the ability to conduct research and analysis longitudinally, right, to speak to Dr. Kurlander's earlier point, so that we can sort of help the whole field better understand students' whole trajectories and where there are opportunities to close equity gaps and improve student outcomes.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Dr. Howell. And the word that really stuck with me when you mentioned it, because we haven't talked about it a lot today, was assessment. I think this data are oftentimes collected, but how are we really using it to look at the programs, the initiatives that we put in place to see if they're successful? I studied public admin, and one of the things we often talked about is, there's a lot of funding to start things, but there's oftentimes not a lot of funding to assess things. And so, how do we really know if the program's effective if we don't use the data to make assessments? So I appreciate the work you're doing. Want to remind the audience that we are about to turn to a Q&A, so any questions you have, feel free to drop them in the chat. But Lisa, I wanted to come to you as well, because you work outside of the Institute of Higher Education, outside of a state agency. You said you also agree that organizations should use disaggregated data. Why do you feel that way?
Well, I mean, I'm a firm believer that more data is more better. I know it's not proper English, but it flows, right? It's tough to even know there's a problem if you can't foresee that it even exists. So the more you can highlight gaps and disparities, the more you can dispel myths and get to the actual truth. These are all things that need to happen in order to make positive changes and include as part of assessments and determine if what you're doing is even working.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate, again, partnership with SAS, and we know y'all collect a tremendous amount of data and do great work with it. So awesome. Well, I will turn it over to an audience Q&A at this point. We've had some awesome questions come in. First, I mentioned a couple of times our issue brief. We're planning on rolling that out in the next week and a half to 2 weeks, hopefully. It's in design right now, so we're excited to get that out. But I know people have asked about it. If you signed up for this webinar, you are in our listserv, and so we will make sure that gets out to everyone on the listserv. So excited to share that with you all. But I think one of the first questions I'll go with, and maybe Mayway, maybe I'll come to you first, because I'm thinking through some of the data that you all collect. But you know, someone asked about equity, and oftentimes centers around race, gender, and age. What are some of the other data that you all collect at LEAD, and how can that help us close some equity gaps?
That's a great question. So the common follow system, we have about 11, at least 10, 11 entity data from different entities that include our the UNC system, community college system, even our Department of Public Instruction, also Department of Health and Human Service. Those departments, they also have the social service program in there. And those disaggregate the come with demographic information, it comes with the gender, race, even the students. Sometimes we actually talk about the student family income level, maybe not a great indicator, but it does address, you know, when you look at this data, especially student employment outcomes, you know, after they participate in the 2-year, 4 years education programs, and then what happened to them, is their outcome compared to, like, general speaking, if you breaking it by different gender or different race or even different income level, you can see the gap there. It's pretty much data. Yes, data can be really messy, but it's pretty powerful to be able to tell you what are the gap between the equity or the gender, or even today actually we did a quick presentation, and Alice was able to look at the data and look at the wage gap between women and men. And I'm going to let Alice provide some additional insight, but you will be amazed that a lot of women, they went to college, but internally wage outcomes, you can see there's a big gap there. So that is something we do need to address. And I say the data can be very powerful and guide us through those policy making.
Yeah, Alex, do you want to quickly add to that?
Yes, and we also have very rich data from the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, and which also provides a good insight on individuals with mental or physical disabilities. So there is a lot also to explore and study there. There is a lot of potential equity gaps, which can be analyzed for those cohorts.
Great, thank you so much for that. That really gives that state level perspective. Dr. Kurlander, if you don't mind, I think I might bring this question to you, and we might not necessarily have an answer because I'm thinking through it as well, but as someone that works in education policy in higher ed, you know, when we think about equity, it's about closing those gaps. But what does equity mean when we start thinking about specific serving population institutions? So like HBCUs or a minority serving institution or a Hispanic serving institution. Someone in the chat asked, they said for an institution like an HBCU where analysis by race would likely not be helpful, what are some of those other student characteristics that might help us close equity gaps at an institution level? Does that question make sense?
It does. I'll actually, I'll take it in a particular way. You can tell me if it's not the way you wanted it. But partly what I'll say is, particularly for this question on institutions, I think we do a lot to document students, but we need a lot more data to document practices and what institutions are doing, and to be able to understand. So a lot of our research, a lot of our work is exploring sort of gaps, individual determinants, if you will, of post-secondary attainment or of assessments. But particularly something like HSIs, which are Hispanic serving institutions. What are the practices, the policies, the actions that are serving, right? So I will quote here from scholars Gina Garcia and Marcel Cuellar from my own institution who does this work, but what are the actual specific practices that HSIs are exploring or to better serve Hispanic students, and then how do those intersect with older students, younger students, female, male students? And so I think some of our data needs to catch up in terms of actual other forms, not just individuals, again, for purposes of disaggregated outcomes, but also for thinking about institutional characteristics.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great portion of it that I don't think I've necessarily thought of, is capturing those practices and how it overlays. So awesome. Thank you for that. I think we might have time for 2 more questions. I'm watching our clock, but I think Dr. Howell, I'll come to you, and then maybe I'll come to you, Lisa, for this next one. But Amanda asked about some examples of using disaggregated data for policy advocacy. How have you seen disaggregated data used, Dr. Howell, to support state or federal policy advocacy?
That's a really great question. We do, at the College Board, we do have a policy team that is thinking hard all the time about the intersection of various state, federal, and of course, district level policies and how that interplays with everything. Because I started with an AP example, I suppose I should wrap with one as well, which is to say that in various states, there's some, actually your neighbor in South Carolina has been experimenting with policies around high school graduation requirements and computer science. For example, that's now a new policy that South Carolina implemented. And the question is, how does a policy like that actually incentivize or disincentivize student level behavior and different types of students to either fulfill a graduation requirement in computer science, like this happens to be? Do students sort of take the easiest course available to them to make sure that they complete that requirement and are able to graduate? Do they challenge themselves when there is an AP version of computer science available in their schools, as there is in most South Carolina schools? I think it's important to understand how policies that are well-meaning may or may not actually incentivize all different types of student subgroups to realize better outcomes. And so I think it's an excellent question about the intersection of policy and the kind of disaggregated data that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Lisa, I want to ask the same question to you, maybe from similar perspective, but slightly different than the work College Board does. How have you seen disaggregated data used for policy advocacy?
So I think one example I have is with a higher education state agency that I worked with. And they were looking closer at a couple of different policies focused around both dual enrollment and remedial courses and how those are handled. And by being able to use disaggregated data, we were able to demonstrate that the outcomes were very different depending on the type of school, the type of student. And so they could more tailor their policies at the state level to fit and follow the better outcomes for their students. And they could provide guidance to those individual institutions based on those outcomes that they were seeing in the disaggregated data and how that flowed to the different type of students.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that, because I think oftentimes we think about state policy and, oh, well, it worked in North Carolina, so it should work in Tennessee, work in Kentucky. But every state has different characteristics, different governance systems. It's all working slightly different. And so how do we adapt and use data to make those changes? Yeah. Great. I think I've got one more question that just came in. So we'll close with this one. So someone asked about bridging the K-12 data gap with college data, that they oftentimes find tremendous gaps in that area. Let's see, I'm seeing a couple of head nods. Maybe I'll go to Mayway and then Dr. Lawley at NCES to quickly answer this question. But Mayway, what has North Carolina done to bridge that K-12 and college data gap? I think you're muted, Mayway, sorry.
Okay, that's a very great question, but I'm going to defer to my colleague, Alice Monchen, to address that. He is the one actually working on the data, and I think he has a better insight to provide, to share with everyone.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. Alice.
We have a very extensive data, which is coming from Department of Public Instructions, from high schools, and then from public community colleges and public university, UNC system. And we, for many years, we have linked this data, and we have a public-facing tool called NC Tower, and it's abbreviation for Tool for Online Workforce and Education Reporting. So we can report for each program, students who graduate from each college, each program for the past 19 years, their employment outcomes, wages, industries they are employed, And we also, we have this running and functional for the post-secondary education. And we are working right now on adding also secondary education data. So we will add outcomes for high school graduates. And plus we also typically get a lot of questions. Can we have this disaggregated by race and gender? So very soon, within the next few months, we will also have high school graduation data outcomes broken down by race and gender.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's great to hear that that's going to be rolling out, particularly as we start thinking about all the post-secondary pathways that are out there for students, not just the traditional four-year path. And so how we're tracking that data coming out of high school. So thanks for that. Dr. Lawley, not to put you on the spot, but just wanted to ask quickly what, at the national level, NCES, how you all kind of combine K-12 and post-secondary data?
I would say at the administrative level, we really aren't able to. There's really nothing that connects the K-12 to post-secondary, and we're legislatively mandated not to have a student unit record system. So there's also that aspect. I would say that some of our sample surveys are better at bridging that gap. So if you were to go and look at the high school longitudinal study or the beginning post-secondary study, you would see some things that connect K-12 to higher education. But when you're looking at administrative data, there would be some real challenges there.
Yeah, appreciate that and honesty on that. There's always the legislative requirements and everything that we all deal with at both the state and federal level. So yeah. That's part of data, and that's part of social science work. I just want to acknowledge, I saw a couple of questions pop up about TRIO, about data on faculty. Those are all great questions. I wish we had time to get to them today, and I think they warrant another conversation on this. This is only scratching the surface on disaggregated data and the way we can use data to really inform the decisions that we're making. But panelists, I really appreciate all your time, all your attention today, and for hanging with us through the agree disagree. I don't think I put anyone too much on the spot. No one was like one disagree while everyone else agreed, so I think we were good. But I really appreciate it. Just as we close this out, I want to remind you of some upcoming Hunt Institute webinars. So Thursday, May 19th. Next Thursday, we have an amazing homeroom with education leaders coming up. Reconsidering school choice in the wake of COVID, how COVID has changed what we look at for school choice. And then May 25th, Wednesday, May 25th, our early efforts from our early childhood team. They're going to be looking at creating ideal learning environments through play. When we move into June, early efforts is going to come back around because they're talking about children thrive in equitable communities, 11 simple rules to help us get there. And then what I'm excited for, post-secondary pathways and what our post-secondary team does. But we're going to be looking at Summer Bridge, creating a sense of belonging for BIPOC students during the transition to post-secondary ed. And so I think this is a place where we can start to get into some of that TRIO conversation that came up earlier as well. But again, we really appreciate you being part of the Hunt Institute family and being here to be a part of the panel. So thank you all, our resource experts, for being here. Audience members, thank you for your support and for being here and for your great questions. Be on the lookout for other upcoming Hunt Institute stuff, and we'll be in touch soon. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Thanks.
Thank you.